So everyone just joining now, we're having our 42nd webinar. So this is the webinar where we reach a milestone of enlightenment. In the last 2.5 years, we've covered all types of topics around compliance, around management, around the very concept of optimizing the supply chain. OpenChain is always about building trust in the supply chain. We started and focus on license compliance, but we're interested in every aspect of trust. And when it comes to things like license compliance, it's always been a bigger picture than how do you follow the letter of a license.
Yep.
The bigger picture includes tooling. It includes how to analyze the outputs of tooling, software bill of materials, all other types of concepts. Now, today, we're going to touch on two of the topics that are pretty close to everyone's heart. One is on the tooling side, but we're going to do strategic tooling. We're going to have a presentation by Feng from SecTrend, the latest OpenChain partner company, about challenges and opportunities for software composition analysis vendors in China. And this is an unusual presentation in some ways because it gives us an insight into what service providers are both thinking about and finding as challenges in one of the world's most important markets for the supply chain. It's an insight that will probably help us not just in the software component analysis context, but also in the context of understanding how the supply chain in China is reacting to things like vendors providing solutions and what's happening next, what's the future. The second presentation is a recording by Phil from Synopsys, and he's building on previous discussions we had from our partners at the M&A Summit. Now, Phil wanted to bring a presentation covering a lot of information regarding metrics around M&A. So he's quantifying open source risk in M&A and bringing numbers that Synopsys has to the table as another way to expand our knowledge and understanding of M&A. So it's going to be a busy meeting. And for that reason, I'm jumping straight to our antitrust policy notice. As always, you can find our full antitrust policy on the Linux Foundation website. And if you are a member company of the LF, you can contact our counsel, Andy Updegrove, with any questions. And at any point, if you have any questions or concerns about antitrust, just let me know immediately in the meeting and we will address them. Okay, now on to the fun stuff. I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Feng for his presentation on the challenges and opportunities for SCA vendors in China. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Shane. And I'm gonna share my screen. Just let me know if you can see my screen. 1 second.
There we go.
All right, you can see my screen, right?
Yes, no problem.
Great. All righty.
Perfect.
All right, I'll just get started. Hey, everybody. So my name is Feng Wang, and so I'm a director of technical marketing and external affairs at SecTrend. First of all, it's very excited to join OpenChain community, and thanks for all the supports from all of you guys. So today, I'm gonna, on behalf of SecTrend, I'm gonna give you guys some introduction about the open source and SCA in China. I will talk briefly about SecTrend and myself first. Then I'll jump into the open source background or how it is in China. And I will also talk about the challenges and opportunities for the SCA vendors, like Shane mentioned, who are probably not familiar with the China market. And last but not least, we're gonna talk about what we can do together with OpenChain in a kind of high level, content. So first of all, about SecTrend. So we are a pretty young startup. We have a 60 plus FTEs, but this number is increasing day by day. A great portion of my colleagues, they're from the top tech firms. So we have a really strong kind of technical background. We are located in Shanghai, China, and then we also have offices in Beijing and Shenzhen. Currently we provide solutions in terms of SCA and SaaS, and also professional services like the open source compliance consulting. We are very honored to be incorporated into the global foundations like the Linux Foundation, OpenChain, and OpenSSF. As far as local, local communities, we are actually a maintainer of open, open Euler, which is I think everybody knows that, which is an open source project donated by Huawei to the Open Item Foundation. And also we are working together with our peers to draft some of the national standards, related to SCA. And also about myself. So actually, I lived in the United States for 11 years and got my degrees, like a bachelor's degree at the University of Wisconsin in electrical engineering. And then I went to the University of Pennsylvania for a master's degree. After that, I worked for Comcast for 4 years as a senior software engineer. And I was an inner source kind of contributor at that time, and I open source some of my components or projects to other divisions of Comcast. Now I serve as a director of technical marketing and external affairs at SecTrend. Where I have the opportunity to dig into the SCA and or DevSecOps with the peers from the globe, and also get involved in drafting some of the national standards of SCA related field. So this is about me, and also about my company SecTrend. The next I'm gonna talk about the open source in China. All right, so open source is very rapidly developing in the world, and I think it has been become a mainstream. Also China has seen a dramatic kind of involvement with open source community or contribution. So the history of open source in China starts from the late 1990s, around when I was born. And at that time, Linux was firstly introduced to China, and then the whole kind of society has developed some acknowledgement of the open source. From the government side, local OSS organizations was established, and China started to get involved into some global OSS organizations. Also, the Android kind of smartphones paved the way for a wider adoption of Linux. Then going to the AI and the cloud era. So the government put a huge efforts in supporting the open source, which results in a larger scale of the development, especially in the cloud computing and the AI industries. After 2018, I would say it's a really tough period because of some external kind of political environment change, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, but on the other side, it really accelerates some of the Chinese independent development of open source from the government or from the intellectual property law perspective. So this is these are some milestones of the Chinese open source. Yeah, and China is trying to build a whole ecosystem around open source, right? You can see from this picture or diagram, whatever you call it. From the bottom layer, you have the operating system, right? To the cloud kind of services and architecture, or the AI framework, to the web, to to database. There are some really China is developing very fast in terms of the open source companies or projects. For example, Ocean Base is a very it's listed as a leader in the Gartner report. It is developed by Alibaba, which provides high performance and high available database. Apollo, which is open source autonomous car driving platform developed by Baidu, is another very, very famous kind of open source project. And some of the the operating systems like by Huawei or Tencent, they're great examples too. Also, community-wise, repository, foundation, alliance, the whole ecosystem is becoming more and more comprehensive. We will touch base on these a bit later. Yeah, so the next is from the contribution perspective, right? China is now playing more and more important role in this kind of open source, because if you see like the number of contributors in GitHub, by 2025, it's gonna be like more or less comparable to that of in the United States. Also, at the same time, the Giti, right? It's a Chinese kind of native alternative to GitHub, has more and more contributors there year by year. And also, if you see the picture on the left, left hand side, underneath, the GitHub contributors, Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, they're among the top companies around the world in the OSCI index. We'll see like more and more Chinese companies coming into this kind of index. Well, like a few years ago, you barely see Chinese companies, right? And open source technology adoption in Chinese companies, it's conducted by the CEICT. What is being it says is 88% of the companies are using open source technologies, and 10% is planning to do so. Yeah, I think these numbers are meaningful to provide you guys a big picture about how open source is matured in China. Okay, so as far as the organizations and the foundations, right? China's first government led open source alliance, COPU, was established in 2004. And after that, more and more open source organizations are or foundations are established. I just listed a few there, like the OS China, which established the GT kind of project, and also Open Item Foundation. A lot of tech giants are donating projects to Open Item, and we'll see more and more donations from all different kind of companies in different sectors. And also, engagement with the global communities like OpenChain, right? OpenSF and Linux Foundation, Apache, all those kind of Eclipse, you name it. We'll see more and more Chinese entities are joining, right? From the law perspective, from the vendors like us, or from end user like Huawei or Honor, and also the government kind of sponsored institute, CEICT. So China is trying to keep up to speed with the global development of open source. All right, so here's this one. All right, so the Chinese government, right? The government is, puts more effort in the development of the open source, which you can see either from the next 5-year plan period kind of framework, which involves the building data intellectual property protection, and also some legal systems. You can see different, you can see in the chart like different opinions or guides from the government, either the State Council or the Policy Bank, the People's Bank of China, on the open source and the intellectual property kind of side. Also, the Supreme Court has made some judgments on the illegal use of software licenses in the recent years. And those kind of law cases have tremendous influence to the high-tech industry and also even, the whole society. All right, so, to sum these up, so China is up to speed to embrace a very rapid development of open source. And from our perspective, open means inclusive, right? So we would like to work closely with our global peers to make contributions to the global open source community. And I believe China will become a more and more important player in this arena. All right, so the next section, I think, is kind of more interesting because I will talk more about the commercial stuff, like the SCA market in China. What kind of challenges and opportunities for like probably like a SCA vendor. First of all, from the venture capital investment, right? You can see from this diagram. SCA or AST related companies are booming, and new startups spring up like mushrooms. The number of vendors doubled compared to that of a year ago. It's such like a tremendous kind of situation, right? You can also see like a few companies, they have been listed in the stock exchange. And when we go to the SCA sales and the forecast, in 2021, the Chinese cybersecurity market size is around like $10 billion US. And it's estimated to have like around 18% compounded annual growth rate in the next 5 years. The market keeps rising, but it's only 1/3 of the global average. So I would say like this market has a great potential. Last year, the SCA market has a size of over, as the SCA market itself has over $60 million US. And the market has seen an over 200% increase in the last 4 years. And the predicted for the next 4 or 5 years, the predicted compounded annual growth rate will be around 40%. So you see like a huge potential in the Chinese market. But while I have to mention like the Chinese market is relatively new because compared to what the US market or the Europe market, so a lot of these are based on prediction or estimation. But I think the number to a large extent can be higher than this. At least from our experience, right? More and more medium and smaller sized companies are asking for SCA solutions, which is really a great tendency for more rapid development in this field in China. All right, so I just talked about the SCA market in China, as well as some predictions. I mean, this slide we'll have just talk about like the SCA opportunities in terms of politics, economy, social culture, and technology, right? So like I mentioned before, the government is supporting supporting building a powerful intellectual property nation in the next couple of years. And you can see that from a more kind of enforced security level protection evaluation from the authority, and also the pertaining to data and personal privacy. As far as open source, right? Because of external kind of environment change, the government puts more effort in constructing an ecosystem. Also from the law cases, we see the legal kind of intellectual property rights can be guaranteed to contributors, which is in a more kind of consistent form with the global understanding. Economy-wise, right? China is undergoing a industrial transformation and upgrade. from those like low kind of grade product manufacturing to high tech products like software, automobile, electronics, or so on and so forth, right? I think this triggers a more challenging situation in protecting the intellectual property, especially for firms that are exporting commercial products or software. They have to obey those related laws. Otherwise, they will be fined, dramatically. Social culture. So the Chinese society has seen a dramatic change in terms of the social culture in recent years. From like ignorance of IP towards a more kind of protecting IP as a general consensus, and also needless speaking technology, right? So from the technical perspective, we have more and more developers that are more willing to make contributions to the whole community. And also the cloud native era enables us to emphasize the importance of the cybersecurity and the software supply chain compliance. It's going to be a focal point for a lot of companies in China. So yeah, I just want to pause here in case anyone has questions. Okay, I'll just move forward.
And if anyone has a question that they want to ask, they can just quickly put their hand up or just put it in the chat. And you can also do it at any time.
Sure. Alrighty. All right, I'll just go ahead. So for challenges to SCA vendors, right? I classified this kind of slides to two different kind of points. One is the local vendors, for local vendors. The other one is for overseas vendors. First of all, for local vendors, right? I mean, China has a late start of this area. So lacking of the right talent is very critical to a lot of local vendors, in terms of a developer, architects, or evangelists. Also the market is growing very fast, but the medium and a small sized company or even the government have just started to realize how important it is to deliver software that is compliant and reliable, right? The third point is that a lot of local SCA vendors, they're based on, their software is, originally is based on the security, kind of evaluation or assessment, instead of IP, intellectual property, or compliance based. So we still have a long way to go for local vendors. For overseas vendors, all right, I think there are some, a special kind of needs from the Chinese market, the Chinese companies, right? One of them is the local support, right? Post-sale local support. This part is missing. I found this part is missing in a lot of overseas vendors, to be honest. And also like some like customization work from the vendor is a general need of a lot of Chinese companies. Also, on-prem solution is a must. Is a must for a dominant percentage of customers in China. In a lot of industries like the finance, SaaS solution is just not acceptable at all. And also the overseas vendors. I think this is a more or less complicated, right? Everybody knows, like, due to the trade war or the the tension between the United States and China, a lot of companies will just like prefer local vendors, because of some reason everybody knows. Like I mentioned before, open source is an area that is very inclusive and open-minded. So we're really welcome to our competitors from other parts of the globe to the Chinese market, right? I think it's a great way for us to learn from each other, both in technology and in the marketing perspective. Yeah, it will definitely benefit all of us. All right. So last but not least, what we can do together with OpenChain in the future. I think this is not really pertaining to one vendor, but all parties should be involved. First of all, promote the standard ISO 5230 in China, making more companies aware of this standard and finally adopt to it. The second point is like more education is needed to the market on a compliant software supply chain, right? And also, the OpenChain, I think, the OpenChain represents the highest level of professional knowledge in terms of technology, law, and other parts. So I think all members should work together to build a trusted open source software supply chain. Finally, all the efforts will result in a broader SCA market and a more willingness for the companies. Companies will be more willing to invest in the SCA related to toolchain, and in return, it will benefit the three to-dos on the top. Yeah, I think this is everything I want to share today. And our slogan is beyond security, more than open source. We're really excited to join the OpenChain family, and we hope to work together with all of you in the future. Thank you so much. And yep,
Thank you, Feng. That's absolutely brilliant. And
Thanks so much.
I think we can never underestimate how fast the market in China is moving, and what that means for us. Everyone in the world.
Yes.
It's interesting that your background is so diverse. You've worked in several different jurisdictions. You know an awful lot about different places. So, I hope you can be one of our gateways between the international community and China moving forward.
Sure. Yeah, I hope to do so. I'm very excited.
And everyone, if you have any question, you can just unmute yourself and ask it. I'm just going to give people a minute to think about if they have a question right now.
Yep.
And while they're doing that, I'm just going to share my screen too, if that's okay. If you can switch off, and perfect. So I'm going to briefly share my screen before we go to Phil. Now we're going to bring Phil from Synopsys in with an interesting way of quantifying open source risk around M&A. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about our survey. Now, you might be tired of hearing about the OpenChain survey, but we're not done with it. We have one more day left for the OpenChain survey, and you'll find the link in the chat. If you haven't yet had a chance to fill out your survey, to describe what your company is doing and what that means, please consider doing so. The OpenChain survey is in simplified and traditional Chinese. It's in German, it's in English, and it's in Japanese. And this survey is actually one of the biggest in open source. We're not just looking at compliance. We're looking at open source business strategy, and we're asking questions about fears, about hopes, about management focus. Now, it's not a huge survey, but it's touching on a lot of points, and I'd appreciate if you were part of it. We will be finishing up May 31st, close of business, US Pacific time, and we will consolidate all of the various bits of information into a global overview of high-level open source strategy. Okay. Now, we're moving on to our final presentation, our second presentation, which is about quantifying risk in open source M&A. For many of you, you've been on the OpenChain calls for a while, So you will have some awareness that we have covered M&A in a summit relatively recently. We had 5 presentations and 1 panel in that summit. So why are we going back to it? Because we've got new information, and most importantly, we have new data. So let's take a look at this presentation from Phil at Synopsys, see what the data is, and understand how it adds to our picture of M&A around the world. If there's any issue with this being shared, let me know. But I do believe we should probably be okay as we try to get this rolling. Just one moment, please. Okay. So here we go. And like I said, any problems, let me know. Having a slight issue on the sharing, but it should still work, I think.
Okay, well, hello, OpenChain, and thanks, Shane. Thanks for having me. Today, I'm going to be talking about risk in M&A, and we'll provide some numbers to quantify what we're talking about. By way of introduction, I run the Black Duck Audit Group at Synopsys, and I think many of you are probably familiar with Black Duck, maybe fewer with Synopsys. I'll just kind of orient you there. So Synopsys is about a $5 billion company, mostly building tools for semiconductors. I'm part of a group called the Software Integrity Group, which builds tools for software, and joined as with the acquisition of Black Duck, which was about four and a half years ago. So within that is an audit group. And that's relevant today because that's where the data comes from. And I'll say more about that in a moment. You know, I talk a lot about this topic, and I have presented these numbers before. And usually I will start with some basics of open source and why it has become so popular as a part of commercial products and what some of the issues are there. But we'll dispense with that for this audience. I think everybody has a pretty good understanding. You know, Shane, your project had a terrific session a few, I guess, probably a month ago now on M&A. So some folks would have been part of that. This may be a little review from that, but of course, open source is great. Unmanaged, it can be risky. And the implications for M&A is that if unmanaged open source is risky, it's especially an issue for smaller companies, where bigger companies just in general tend to have more resources to apply to you know, dealing with things other than just getting the product out the door, which is the real focus for small companies. I hear from a lot of folks in the M&A community on the acquirer side that deeper pockets may be an issue drawing fire. A small company with any kind of issue with which, you know, someone might have an axe to grind may be an uninteresting company to sue. But once they get bought by a bigger company, that can be, you know, shine a light on it, and it's more profitable to go after such a company. Some investors, private equity investors, have to think about divestment. And all these apply to any issues with the company, and not even just within the technology of the company. But when a private equity firm is buying a company, it is in anticipation of selling at some point. And so any issues they find, they're going to have to deal with along the way. And then another consideration is just making the business case and planning integration. So any issues with a company that will require resources to address need to be figured into the planning process. So open source, and I personally have been involved in working with M&A clients on a variety of software issues for about 8 years. My organization's been at it longer than that. And during that time, considerations of open source have gone, as part of M&A deals, have gone from being a bit unusual to really being the norm. That includes both the looking into the processes around managing open source, but the code, the code itself. And I'll be emphasizing that. And certainly OpenChain plays a role there in the process piece of that. And we'll circle back to that. So I alluded to the data. It comes from a report that we've been putting out annually for about 7 years. And it is based on the software that we see as part of my bit of the business, which the Black Duck Audit Group provides services to companies generally in an M&A transaction, usually on the buy side, sometimes on the sell side of the M&A transaction. And so we collect that data up, we anonymize it, we aggregate it together, and we've got a cybersecurity research center. The topic is not going to be limited to security, but this is done under the auspices of our cybersecurity research center that does a lot of work on identifying open source vulnerabilities. The software that we're talking about is primarily software of technology companies. So where we get involved is where, and I haven't really defined technology company, but really where the software is the business or is a big part of the business. So it's certainly software companies, SaaS companies, system companies where there's a lot of software involved. And there's some data in here, but a very little bit that is outside of the M&A use case. And most every one of these audits was companies that were the software of companies that were involved in an M&A transaction. Now, this report is available. You can go to Synopsys website. You can read it yourself. And I will say it is code-based oriented. And I'm gonna say a little more about that. And part of what I'm doing with the numbers here is translating or providing both numbers on a code-based basis, but also on an M&A transaction basis, which would really be more relevant to folks in the M&A space. So code bases and transactions. As I say, the report presents data about code bases, which is roughly equal to applications. The reality is what happens is we get into it with a target in an M&A transaction. We figure out how to logically break up all the code that comprises their products or their or is the basis of their services, and it's a pretty reasonable analogy or equation to make it to think of code bases as applications. But on average, every transaction we're involved with includes 4 code bases, or actually a little more than 4 code bases. So in general, and this isn't I think it's not a mathematical proof, but I think you can say that in general, there's a greater frequency of any type of issue on a transaction basis than a per code based basis. And I've got 2 analogies here. One is if flipping heads is a problem, and you try it once, and that would be like on a code base, you got a 50-50 shot. But if there's 4 code bases and you flip the coin 4 times, there's a much better chance that you'll get heads at least once, and that there will be a problem, across those 4 flips or those 4 code bases. And my other analogy was people. If there's a percentage of people in the world with blue eyes, and there's a percentage of families who have somebody with blue eyes, and that's going to tend to be a higher percentage. But I say it's not a mathematical proof because I think you can construct odd corner cases with different size families. If you have a family with 100 people and everybody's got blue eyes, you could make a case that those percentages might be different. But anyway, we will be talking per transaction as well as per code base, and that's just to sort of translate between the numbers that you see in the report and what they would mean in terms of implications for M&A transactions. Okay, so into the numbers with a bit of wind up there. We looked at about 2,400 code bases, and this is our 2022 report looking back to 2021. And that was something on the order of 500 transactions. A little more than that for technical reasons. There's some work we did that was eliminated from the study, but think of it as about 500 transactions. About most, but not all of those transactions included a security assessment. So when I talk about numbers with respect to license issues, that's on 100% of those transactions. And when I talk about security and some of the other operational areas, that's on a large subset of call it 85, 87%. So almost all of the code bases had some open source, and 100% of the transactions included some code with open source. And I think for folks in this community, that's not a big surprise. You understand that there's a lot of open source being used, but I think it is notable that the number is so high. Every year, that number by code bases is in the sort of 97, 98, 99% range. And I have dug into the code bases that have no open source. It's unusual, but not, but there are some. And in almost all cases, they're very small code bases, maybe less than 1,000 files, say. So I think even on a code base basis, you can say that for any code base or any application of any size, there's almost 100% chance that there's going to be some open source in there. And just to give you a sense, these are the industries of the companies that we audited. They are ranked, so big ones at the top: enterprise software and SaaS, healthcare, big data, of course, fintech is not a surprise, cybersecurity. All these sort of greatest hits of software these days are covered, and then into some, and I won't call them obscure, but some less frequent industries, at least in terms of our auditing, would be virtual reality, gaming, education, a little less in telecom. But certainly I wanted to give you a sense we're covering a broad spectrum of industries. So now to talk about, we've said that 100% of the code bases, or 100% of the transactions, near 100% of the code bases had some open source. The question is now how much? And I'm showing that number here on a code base basis. I don't have history by transaction. We just started doing that this year, but on a code base basis, it's been monotonically increasing since we started the study. And I think this goes back to 2018, and I hope that shows up okay for you. But I think the year we started it, we were in the neighborhood of 40% of the an average code base. And the way what this number is literally we look at all the code that we looked at across the year. And if you put it in a big pot, stir it all up, it's this year 78% open source. And bear in mind, as I said at the beginning, these are companies that are would probably consider themselves as having proprietary software for the most part, at least. So they are technology companies getting bought by other companies for the value in the software, and even there, about 78%. So I think my expectation, we don't have good numbers on this. My expectation is in enterprises and banks or retailers or insurance companies where most of the software is for their own use, my expectation is that number is even higher. It can't go too much higher than 78. I think you can see the curve is flattening out, and it can't go to 100. So I think it wouldn't surprise me if it was 77 next year, but it's nonetheless a high number. And then the next question is what is that made up of? It's a lot of components. So on a per code base basis, it's about 500, and then across transactions, and it's not 4 plus times 500, but it's about 1,700. The reason it's not 4 times is there is some overlap in types of components. across applications. So I guess it's the message here, and you know, from the perspective of OpenChain is if we were just talking about 10 components, half a dozen, 20 components, you probably don't need as much of a process as is described in the OpenChain spec. Life would be a lot easier. But 500 of anything or 1,700 of anything is pretty tricky to manage. And so it's that really speaks to why so many companies today still are not doing a very good job or don't have a very good handle on what is making up their code. And our anecdotal experience with targets in M&A transactions bears that out. So we find that few targets are able to produce a list with any confidence. Some targets do produce a list, and when they do, it tends to be 50 or 60% accurate. Sometimes it's vague, and I won't have to explain this too much. This audience will get. We got a list of components from one company a couple of years ago, and the first item on the list was Apache. So that's pretty vague. It tends to be pretty high level. You know, certainly if somebody's using the Spring framework, they know that. They know the bigger. It's not surprising that they might know the bigger pieces, but it's often incomplete. And I think you all understand, you know, how ubiquitous open source is and how easy it is for developers to use. So if a company is not deliberately trying to manage, they're necessarily going to have an incomplete view. I heard an interesting stat. We just had a conference earlier this week, and Steve Hendrick, the VP of Research for the Linux Foundation, spoke about a study they had done that he had conducted on SBOMs, but he also gave kind of a sneak preview of the OpenSSF study that's coming out. And one of the stats he cited, and I think I have this right, is that only about 50% of companies even have an open source policy, which to my mind is table stakes for managing any of this stuff. And he broke it down further into by size of company, and not surprisingly, the percentage was higher in bigger organizations and lower in smaller organizations. So that kind of bears out what we're talking about here. So license issues, and again, with a different audience, I might elaborate on what this is about, but I think you all are pretty well tuned in. I will talk about what we mean by unlicensed software and custom licenses. But let me give you the numbers first, and then I'll define those. So we found it, and the convention through the slides is I tending to keep code bases on the left and transactions on the right. So 53% of the code bases contained license conflicts, just meaning components whose licenses conflicted with the way that the work as a whole was to be licensed. And that translated into almost 90% of the transactions having some amount of license conflicts. And in many cases, it was a lot. And then in addition to that, 30% of the code bases had no license or custom licenses. And again, I'll talk a little bit about that. And that was 71% on a transaction basis. So I'll also mention dual licenses. So none of these numbers include dual licenses. We do flag dual licenses. I don't have data on that, but you know, MongoDB with their open source license that's pretty you know, commercially difficult, and then they've got a commercial license, and there are a number of companies that have that. Take that approach. So we flag those and suggest they be looked at, but we don't call them license conflicts. Of course, they would be if the company didn't have a commercial license, then they would be subject to the open source license, typically reciprocal, and typically they're not following the rules on that. So that would turn into a license conflict, but we haven't included those. So unlicensed or no license and custom license. So there's a fair amount of software available for which the copyright holder is expressing no licensing terms. There's nothing in the comments. There's no license.txt or README or copying file, and there's no indication in any metadata of what the license is. And so we would call that unlicensed. And that might be code from a blog. That might be code that was in a GitHub repository that just had no associated license. Custom licenses are, and sometimes it's a stretch to call it a license, but we will flag like comments we find in the code from the developer that express some kind of usage rights and some kind of obligation. So I remember one, for example, that we flagged was you can use my software in your software, but you should mention me in articles in scientific journals. And so we would flag that, and depending on the company, they might think that's benign, or they might think, no, that's an obligation we really can't track and can't make. And so that's what I'm talking about in numbers below the 30 and the 71%. Just to give you a sense, and I'll not go through these, but the licenses we're talking about that conflict, and you'll not be surprised to see a number of the GPL family in here, Mozilla public license, and then a number of Creative Commons licenses as well. Surprising to me, because I never think of those as, I don't think they were developed for use with software, but they show up quite a bit. So security is a growing focus in M&A, and these are articles that are kind of once a year over several years where some business publication will catch on that security is a big deal in M&A. And to me, it's just, software security, cybersecurity is a big deal everywhere, and what is everywhere is also going to impact M&A. And then with respect to open source and security, high profile vulnerabilities over the years have really focused attention on it at least sporadically, but I think in general, we've certainly seen the heightened sensitivity around open source vulnerabilities in particular over time. So going back to Heartbleed and Equifax with Apache Struts, we kicked off this year with the whole Log4j thing, and then the president's executive order, President Biden's executive order, calling out, specifically the importance of the software bill of materials, I think really reflects the sensitivity of the world today. Similar with open source, we can talk about the frequency. So I've got some trends on the code base basis. So this year it was 81% of the code bases had one vulnerability, and 49%, almost half, were high risk. High risk really reflects that they're being exploited and they're pretty easy to, and/or that they're pretty easy to exploit. And that's, we saw it come down a bit this year. I don't necessarily call that a trend. I would, hold off till next year to see where that's going, but it could be indicative that the world is starting to get things under control. On a transaction basis, almost every transaction had some vulnerable components, and about 79% were of high risk. And on a transaction basis, it was a large number of vulnerabilities that we saw. And I will say that it is not necessarily the case that all of these vulnerabilities are exposed, or that some of them may have been on applications that are internal, and companies may have different policies for public facing versus internal, but still quite significant. And the reason, and again, I think we have a knowledgeable audience here, in contrast to commercial code where vendors are pushing patches, as That's not the way the open source world works. A project doesn't know who its users are, and there's no sort of push. Projects will publicize, will put things in the NBD, will responsibly disclose, but it's really up to a user, or I shouldn't say user, a consumer, an organization that has integrated an open source component to monitor that component and keep an eye on the latest versions and security fixes. And so this is really the last set of stats, but this is what we call operational factors, and it's kind of related to security in that what we're really talking about is how current the open source components are in the code base. So we look at things like no development in 2 years, components being out of date, and components that were not on the latest version. And you have kind of high percentages across the board on both a code base or application basis as well as a transaction basis. And really, this is indicating little about the open source per se, but indicating that companies are not maintaining the components they use very well. And so the typical pattern is a company that doesn't have a process to log, track, monitor, maintain will have developers bringing in components and not staying on top of them, not upgrading over time. And it's not necessarily a problem. There may be a component that's 2 years out of date and not being developed anymore and works just fine, but it does indicate some laxness in the management overall, which will be problematic with other components. So conclusions. Open source has become a frequent topic in M&A diligence, and it should be. I think the numbers speak for themselves. Buyers need to understand deal risk and to adjust accordingly, and adjust may mean adjusting the terms of the deal. It may be putting some protections in the reps and warranties around the deal. It may be simply adjusting their going forward plans to address any issues that show up. And so, the advice would be to include open source as part of process diligence. And that's, a framework describing best practices would be very useful in that regard. And so certainly, OpenChain is an important part of that. But also, where the rubber meets the road is in the code. And so we would suggest that third-party audits often make sense, and in particular, if the target company doesn't seem to have their act together, isn't doing anything like what OpenChain would prescribe, then the importance of an audit is even greater. For sellers, my advice would be to be mindful, to understand the issues with open source, and to expect that when the time comes to sell the company, there will be questions. They will be expected to have their open source act together and to be able to provide at least a pretty good idea of what the open source is in the code. And absent that, will likely be asked to go through an audit. So I would certainly suggest, I run things through my brother-in-law test. What would I tell my brother-in-law, who's a software guy, if he started up a company? And I would say, think about at least self-certifying with OpenChain, at least using OpenChain as guidance for those things you need to do to be prepared once due diligence rolls around. So thank you all again for your time, and thanks Shane for having me. I'm not live. We've recorded this in advance, but as Shane and I have discussed, if you have questions, we'll be happy to address them. And if you'd like a paper that kind of outlines what I just talked about today, I do have a link here, but I think the easier thing is just go to our website and search for M&A white paper. And if you'd like to see the full study, that's pretty prominently featured as well. You can search for open source study on the Synopsys site. So that's it. Thank you, and have a good day.
All right, everyone. We're just at the top of the hour. I saw that we had some action in the chat, and Feng has shared his slides, so that's great. If anyone has questions, we'll be able to take them and send them on to Phil. Ted has just posted a question, and he's got a question for Phil about, has Synopsys done audits in this region, China, and what would be the average cost per audit? I'll forward that to Phil so he can take it up with you. So just let me know your email address so I can do the intro and make sure that everyone is connected. Thank you, Ted. All right, and if there's no more questions, we will call it a day there, and we will publish this recording in a couple of days for the community to catch up. Thank you everyone for attending. It was quite a large webinar audience, and have a safe day.